Hello, Missladypetal here. This is my paper bead tutorial for making a style of bead that looks very much like a charm bracelet. It has a metal core and is very smooth on the surface. And look, to be honest, most people tell me that my paper beads are very, very round. And they don't really look like paper beads. So I'm going to do this tutorial to teach you how to make beautiful beads that you can put on a charm bracelet, and you can use them as jewellery. Now, I also sell these on my Etsy store, but I'm going to take you through a step-by-step process on how to make them. There's some materials that you'll need to be able to complete this so that your beads look like my beads. I'll have a complete materials list in the comments below this video, and I suggest before you go any further with this video that you pause and have a look at those things, because I'm going to do this step by step so that you can pause the video in between each stage and catch up if you need to and rewind it, you know, and keep using it as a reference tool. All right, so step one. For a charm bead, instead of having one strip, you actually need two strips. And I've actually done the Frugal Crafter tutorial on this, and I found that her beads were 1/2 inch. So she said to do 1/2 inch. So on my Tim Holtz ruler, 1/2 inch is that long. So my beads, when I made them, they turned out to be quite large. And I'll have a look and see if I've got any in my part done thing here to show you what they look like. So I'll compare. So here's one of my larger beads. So when I did the Frugal Crafter tutorial, I made a bead that was that wide. Now, that wide. This is the width that I ended up determining was the most optimal. So these are longer at 1/2 inch, and that was the tutorial. These are 8mm. So they're not even a centimetre wide, but if you have a look at that on the Tim Holtz ruler, you have a look, and I'm going to put this next to the 0. So you can see that here. Right. So they're just, when you're cutting your paper, the strip needs to be 8mm in metric, but if you're doing it to do with inches, it's like 1, 2, 3/5, probably a touch smaller because I'm going from the edge, so in between. So have a look at the ruler and have a look at the fact that it's not quite 3/8, just over 1/4 inch, and in between the next. So the easy thing that I did when I go to cut these beads now is I just marked, and you can see here, I'm sorry if this camera just wobbles just that tiny little bit while I'm doing this, because I have my tripod set up and I actually need to walk around it to do a few things. But I don't know if you can see, but on here I have little marks, and I line mine up with that. So I know when Jelly Belly says that she's done her paper bead tutorial that sometimes you mark it, but I'm going to show you that it's easy to just not. So to cut, I just go up to that 3rd notch. For me, it's on a Fiskars thing, and it's just past the edge. So if you have a look, it's just past the edge of the cutting. and then I get my strip. Now if I want to do the diagonal, you need the edge to come out and you'll have to flip it over. You'll need the edge to come out to that, the very top, but the bottom will need to line up and be as thin as possible, and it lines up with the actual cutting groove. Now when you're doing that, and I'll just set it so that it's perfect. When you're doing that, you always cut from the wider edge. You never start from this thin edge. So now I have the very thin strip, and that strip must match up at each end because we actually roll them together. So the easiest way that I do is I cut a whole heap of these 8mm strips. That one just seems to be a little bit wider at the end, so I'm going to correct it. Yeah, it's definitely a bit wider than that little bit there. So I cut all my straight strips first, and I tend to make these because I sell them in my Etsy store, and that paper has actually made that bead, so it's interesting that the bead doesn't look anything like really the paper that it starts from. So basically you'll decide how many of these beads in any one paper that you'll want to make, and then you'll cut all the straight strips, and then you'll cut your diagonal strips. And the diagonal strips, I've already cut the first one, and see it's how it's on the diagonal. So I can now do that the opposite way. So I'm going to cut from the bottom because that edge is already there, and that's why I've got that edge at the bottom as well. Line it up at the top. And there you've got your second strip. And I just keep going like that until I've done the number that I want to do. So that's how you cut your strips. I strongly recommend that you find a width that's good for you, but I find that width, and here's one without a core, I find that width is an optimum size for wearing for jewellery. But you may want to use these. I mean, compared to this, there's no comparison as far as I'm concerned about cores and wearability. So this will be, I'll stop the video and we'll go on to the next part. For the next part of this video, it's all about rolling. Now, I have a bead core roller, right? So there's my bead rolling tool. But have a look. That there is the size of the core of the bead. Now, for this larger style bead and to fit these metal cores, that hole is much rounder. And what I've found, and take my tips on board because I had to learn this the hard way, is that this is a number 10 needle. You can see the 10. You need a number 9. Now number 9's a little bit bigger, so what I did was I put washi tape, or actually masking tape because it's not as slippery as washi tape, and I wrapped it around the knitting needle until it got to the size of the bead core, and the bead core would slip through it. However, my tip for you is to maybe add 1 or more 2 layers of masking tape, because what I found was I roll my beads quite tightly. You want to have good structural integrity for your beads. Now, if you wind them tightly, what you find, and this bead's a good example, so I'll pop it on, is that when you go to put your core on, the hole is actually too small and it will make the paper crumple up, the inner layers crumple up inside. and you'll have to file them away, and then you can't seal them properly because they're, you know, it just hasn't fit. So I added an extra 2 layers in of the masking tape for this one. You might have a number 9 needle and you'll just have to test. Oh, also, I got my bead cores off eBay. I think I got 500 pairs for about $3.50 delivered. And I searched for Pandora style cores, bead cores, and those were the ones I got, because I essentially wanted them to fit on a charm bracelet that was very similar to a Pandora style bracelet. So the first thing we'll do is you get your paper, and I always curl it a bit. For my mind, I always curl it a bit, and then I sit there and I line it up, and I have to twirl it, and you want these edges to be as even as possible. Now this will take a little while to twirl, so just watch what I do. And see, I pull it this way as I'm, so that I know that when I'm rolling it, I know that it's tight. Alright, so we're getting to the end. Now before I glue, I hold on to that and I actually pull it off, and then I press the ends together, and not only do I press them together in my hand, but I press them together into the table before I glue, and then I just pull it a little bit more, get a dot of glue. A good tacky glue is essential. And then if your glue comes out, right, so then you get your glue and you press tightly as you're doing it, and you'll see the glue beading up, and that's okay. You don't want any excess glue on that joint, and then I go over and I rub that joint and go back over it a little bit so that it's wedged into the joint. Now you have a fast tacky glue so that that bead then is secure. One thing I've learned is that you need one of those erasers that gets glue, the sticky glue off things. Let me see if I can find my eraser for getting glue off. It'll be in my little box of doodads somewhere. I can't find it at the moment. Hence the joys of doing lots and lots of paper beads with lots of gluey fingers. Right, so the next thing we do is we pick up this and we have a look at where the join is. And I'm going to match that up exactly. Now you can see a white edge there, so I'm going to snip that off just with a pair of my trusty craft scissors. Just the edge. Sometimes they won't exactly match up, and this is something that you want your pattern to try and match up a bit, and the width. Right, so now I just put a bead of tacky glue here, and then I just rub this into it a bit so that it goes up into that join, and then spread it out, and then you join. And of course, of the angle I'm using. So I always use my fingers as a guide for this first join. There we go. Use my fingers as a guide, because then they start to just push it in. Because it starts to taper. Once you go past that join, you're right. Starts to taper at this point, and that gives you your nice round, and that's something that you need to have a look at, that as in rolling normal paper beads, that the distances from each of the edge is still equidistant. So that's a little bit out, and you can pull it down a bit at this stage. At this point, I get my glue and I bead it along, right along, finely along, right to the end. Then I sit there and I just push it in equidistant. And you'll see a little bit of that white glue there, but you really want it to form a strong bond where you can't see the end. Now that bead there is just that little bit sticky. At this point, I can still push it so I can get that shape perfectly cylindrical, but it's looking pretty good. Okay, so we'll go to the next step. The next step in the process is to actually seal it. So I use like a matte Mod Podge. I actually personally use my homemade Mod Podge, which is 2/3 white wood glue, or in the States probably Elmer's glue, and 1/3 water. It dries to a matte finish. It's a little bit less sticky. And you make sure you set the inside. I always put my thing inside so that the whole inner core is set, and then the edges don't move, because these rolled edges, once they're set, they don't move. And it's okay. I often use the technique of doing it this way so that they'll sit in the ridges. Because those ridges then won't move. Okay, I'll go and get my bead drying. Yeah. So the next step after that is to pop them on a toothpick, and that's my bead drying tool. And to let your bead dry. Now that has to be really, really, really dry. I recommend leaving them after this stage. That particular glue actually dries really fast. So it doesn't matter if you leave it, you can leave it for an hour, but I wouldn't leave it any less than an hour, because the next stage we're going to be sealing it with a UTEE. So I'll close this off now and we'll go to the next stage. Okay, we're at the exciting part now. You're on the home stretch. In this part, I use a thick UTEE, and I actually use Ranger thick clear UTEE. You get your embossing pad. Now I'm using these beads that already have one coat of UTEE on them, so they're pretty easy to do. You stick them on your toothpick and then you roll them across the pad. Now, you generally do not want to get the UTEE on this side core, because those pieces is where you're going to glue your metal cores. Now at this point, you could colour those. See, they're looking a little bit white. Now I have beads where I colour. So I'll show you another set that I've done where I've coloured them. So these are black, right? They have a little bit of gold leaf on them, but they're pretty much black. And I've used a black marker to actually do the sides of the cores. If you're using like a pink or whatever, you might use a paint pen. Right, now the important thing once you get to this stage is I actually have a tiny spoon that I use, and I tip the UTEE over it. Why do I do that and not just roll it in? Because I don't want the grains getting into the sides, but I also want to try and build it up in the middle as much as possible, because you want that nice round dome kind of look. And so I don't mind if it piles up, but I tap it off at the end and I just check the edges. Then I get my heat tool and this will warm up a bit. And you want to see this set. And it sets to a glass-like finish. And you make sure that it's set all around the edges. And then you pop that in to dry. You'll do all your beads like that, and then you'll do a second coat. So that particular bead there has a second coat. So I'm just going to let that bead dry for a sec. And we'll stop this part and then we'll get to the point where you glue the cores in. Okay, so now we're going to glue the cores in. So I've got 2 cores here, and look, I've painted them with a special metal paint, but most of the cores are just plain metal. And I'm interested to see how those ones will wear on a bracelet like that. So I've got those, but most of them are the silver colour. So you get your tacky glue. I'm using Tombow liquid glue, and I tend to glue around in here, and I let it just go into the edges because you want that edge done, because again it seals the bead very, very well, dries clear. And let it go in. Doesn't matter if it forms a complete pocket. These beads should just pop straight in. I usually get a rag at this point and give them a bit of a wipe over. And then I get a toothpick and I just sort out the inside. If there's any glue in there, you spread it around. And then you can leave this bead to dry. It's as simple as that when you're gluing in the cores. Let's try another pair. Sometimes you can make a little mistake and your cores are just too tight. So you have to be aware of that. Or they can be too loose. It's better to be just that little bit loose than too tight. And often, that one fits in perfect. Often, what I find is that if there is a little bit of UTEE that's stuck in, if you do get it, like I've got a little bit of paper in there, you can see that. I can just file that off later. But you just want to make sure that that bond's nice and smooth, and then you let it dry. At the end, you may need to run one of your small files through the middle, but essentially that's now finished. And then you end up, when that's dry, with a bead that looks like that. And then you can thread that onto a bracelet. And it can go in with your other Pandora style beads. if you've got any questions about this video, you can leave a comment in the comments below. If you are in the Crazy Island family, feel free to message me within the Crazy Island family. I'm quite happy to do a questions and answers video after this if I really need to, but I think it's really pertinent to have a look at each section of this video. I'm pretty fast at doing this now. I've done them a lot. My first attempt at videoing this process was much longer because I was learning how to do it, and I had to redesign the width and the dimensions of those paper strips, and then also the width of the core. So now that I've got those perfected, the important thing is just make sure you get the right tools right, have a look at your materials list, then you'll be rolling beads like a pro. I don't even use a bead core roller, although for me, because the bead core roller, you roll your beads much faster. If I can possibly get one custom made for a core that fits one of these, then I'm looking into that at the moment. But thus far, I haven't found one. But that's the only thing that I do to change that process. Alright, if you have any further inquiries, like I said, leave a question. I'm happy to answer all your questions in the comments below. Thanks very much for watching, and good luck rolling your Missladypetal bracelet beads. Thank you.